Okay, I'm just going to check with my fellow panelists that I'm audible. Yeah, great, thank you. Well, welcome everybody. Before anything, just a tiny little bit of housekeeping. So Brittani is going to speak for around 45 minutes or so. And then we'll move to Q&A. And I'd ask you to type any questions that you may have into the Q&A function rather than the chat. While Brittani is talking, questions will be visible to everybody. And we'll work through those questions in order at the end. This event marks pretty much the first anniversary of the centre here at Kent, and it's a pleasure to mark it with the inaugural Incomindios Lippuner Scholarship lecture. As you'll hear, Brittani is already doing exceptional work, and we're really looking forward to seeing what she achieves in the future. Non-Indigenous scholarship in Indigenous studies has all too often tended to be extractive, much like the industries that Brittani is going to be talking about this evening. We at the Centre don't excuse ourselves from that history, but we do ask what it means to work responsibly and ethically with Indigenous scholars and communities. Among other things, we see that responsibility as beginning with the amplification of the work of Indigenous scholars and grassroots activists. We strive to increase understanding among British and European audiences of the issues that work raises, and we welcome collaborations with organisations that work more directly with Indigenous communities and activists, such as Incomindios. Today's talk speaks to all three of those aims, and we're glad and indeed privileged to host this event. It's particularly wonderful to be able to welcome an international audience, and we hope that you'll stay in touch. As well as conferences and events like this, the Centre runs reading groups and research seminars, hosts visiting researchers, is home to several research projects, a literary journal, and we welcome contributions to our blog. Before Brittani begins, I'm going to hand over to our collaborators at Incomindios UK to say a little about the scholarship and then to introduce Brittani's talk. So first up is Alicia Cromer, who co-founded and leads Incomindios UK and is also co-president of Incomindios Switzerland. And Alicia will then hand over to Leandra Neffin, who's an enrolled member of the Omaha Tribe of Nebraska and a board member for the Omaha Tribe Historical Research Project and Incomindios UK, among a number of other important endeavours. So over to you, Alicia.
Thanks very much, David. Hope you can all hear me. Can you hear me okay? Great. I'm delighted to be here today alongside all of you to hear from our outstanding Incomindios Lippuner scholar, Brittani Orona. I would just like to say a few words about Incomindios and our scholarship program before we start. So Incomindios is a Swiss-based human rights NGO, which has been running since 1974, with now a growing branch in London, UK. And our focus is on the protection and promotion of Indigenous and environmental rights. So we have a priority on Indigenous peoples in the Americas, but also globally. It's been an honor to partner with Professor David Stirrup and the University of Kent with this aim of providing funding for Indigenous youth scholars. Despite the very turbulent 2020 we've had and this pandemic, we were amazed to see many applicants from Canada and the US apply. And it was a very difficult process to select our finalists because each applicant was amazing. But this speaks all the more to the great work that Brittani's doing. One of the key initiatives of our NGO is to support the emerging, rising Indigenous youth voices as they pursue the promotion and protection of Indigenous and environmental rights, which is in its essence, the protection of the planet. And this is something that's absolutely critical for all of us now, especially as we face the urgent threat of climate change. Just quickly, I need to speak to the origin of this scholarship, which truly began with Heinz and Eva Lippuner. Heinz Lippuner is a Swiss humanitarian, and he is a founding member of Incomindios in Switzerland. Then together with the support of his wife, Eva, they championed Indigenous rights and supported Indigenous communities around the world for decades. His wife, Eva, sadly passed away, and in lieu of flowers, people were asked to donate to the Incomindios Lippuner Scholarship Fund, which has led us to where we are today. So this legacy is now taken up in Switzerland and the UK, partnered with the University of Kent, and we wish to continue to grow it next year. In building on this legacy and in anticipation for the next phase of the scholarship, where we open the doors to Central and South America for applicants, we would ask that you consider donating to this. And if so, I will post the email address in the chat box. And if you could send us an email with the header Incomindios Lippuner Scholarship, we would be delighted to hear from you, and we can give you instruction how to donate. I'm sure you will all be absolutely enlightened, challenged, and inspired by Brittani's talk. And we would ask that you continue to build this great cause with us. Again, I just want to honor Heinz and his departed wife, Eva Lippuner, for making this possible to begin with. This could also not be done without Helena Nyberg, Pascal Elsner, Daniel Schmidt, our Swiss board, Caroline Franchi, Jacob Smith, Danny Payne, Claudia Claros, and of course, again, a huge thank you to Professor Stirrup and to Leander Neffen, and of course, Brittani Orona. In the NGO world, our efforts are never solo, but always collaborative. So, and thank you as well to the audience. I commend you for being here, and through your listening and participation, you're taking part in a transformative process where we ask you to take what you've heard and share it with others. And I'll hand it over to you now, Leandra.
Thank you, Alicia. Udo Wangide Tatite, it's good to see you all here today. I'm extremely pleased to introduce Brittani, who is the recipient of our first Incomindios Lippuner Scholarship Award. Like, as David and Alicia both said, this is something I've been working on behind the scenes as a board member with Incomindios UK and in partnership with the University of Kent. I'm so excited to see this finally come to fruition. And on a personal level, this means so much to me that we've been able to create cross-cultural understanding and collaboration with our global Indigenous communities. So with that being said, I'm honored to present Brittani Orona. Brittani is an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe in Northwestern California, and she is a PhD candidate in Native American Studies at UC Davis with a designated emphasis on human rights. She has MAs in Public History and Native American Studies at CSU Sacramento and UC Davis, and a BA in History from Humboldt State University. She has over 14 years experience working with federal, state, and local government, including her current work as the Tribal Affairs Program Manager for the California Department of Parks and Recreation, doing work around NAGPRA and ecological knowledge in state parks, highlighting the ongoing stewardship of California's Indigenous people. She has also worked for the California Department of Toxic Substances Control as an environmental justice and tribal affairs specialist with a number of museums and cultural sites. Brittani is also a freelance project manager for cultural resources management, archives, exhibition, and oral history projects. In her academic work, Brittani was a Schweitzer Scholar in 2019 with the Robert and Patricia Schweitzer Foundation. Brittani also studies how Indigenous communities perpetuate their visions of the world through performance, film, museum exhibition, and art in large-scale environmental justice movement. Besides her PhD dissertation, which is slated for publication with Heyday Press, she has published articles on NAGPRA, environmental justice, and the subject of today's talk. This is our home. This is our land, visualizing decolonization on the Klamath River Basin. One of the largest and most important rivers in the Northwest, the Klamath River started being dammed by Pacificorp at the turn of the 20th century, leading to a decline in water levels, volumes of toxic algae in the resulting reservoirs, and a devastating decline in salmon numbers. Campaigns to undam the Klamath have been ongoing since the early 21st century, involving all four of the Indigenous nations for whom the Klamath has been home for centuries, and has included protests in Scotland against Scottish Power, who owned Pacificorp in the early 2000s. The last decade has seen legislation and a commitment to removing 4 of the Klamath's 8 dams. And you may even have seen a BBC report in November of this year on what is monumental engineering task in its own right. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Brittani.
Thank you, Leandra, and thank you to Incomindios for funding the scholarship that I have, which it's a huge honor to have it and to be the first Lippuner scholar. So I really do want to Professor Stirrup and the University of Kent for supporting this talk as well. So today I will be sharing my dissertation work related to decolonization, visual sovereignty on the Klamath River Basin. And I will start by sharing my screen. So Heang Homalia Satien Juan, the Deton Ante Hoya Brittani Orona. I am, as Leander mentioned, an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe. And that being a Hupa person is probably the most important thing about me. I talk about being Hupa quite a bit. It's been the focus of both my PhD work and my professional career, is uplifting the stories of California Indian people. And so when I was 16, there was a massive fish kill in 2002 on the Klamath River and the Trinity Rivers. And that moment was, and that event was the catalyst of a very strong advocacy movement to remove the Klamath River dams. And so this talk is really, will go through the efforts and advocacy efforts of Indigenous artists, activists, people, grassroots advocacy movements and organizations who have come together to really push on the state and corporations. Right now, the dams are owned by PacifiCorp, as Leandra mentioned, to remove the dams on the Klamath and to renew the river. And there has been a lot of visual sovereignty movement around this as well. So within the arts, performance, theater, documentary, there's a few documentaries that have documented the history of the Klamath River as it relates to the dam removal. So without further ado, I will start this presentation. So I always kind of like to start this talk by situating California Indian history within the context of the United States history and world history. So for those of you that are not familiar with California, California Indian tribes are very, very diverse. We're probably the most diverse group within the United States, maybe second only to Alaska. But California Indian tribal groups, as you see here in these maps, are broken down between cultural areas. But this map also is incomplete because of the ways in which we see ourselves, how we situated our societies, our ceremonial practices are different from each other. So my own people, my tribe, come from the Hoopa area. So I'm using my cursor to circle where the Hoopa Valley is. Our neighboring tribes are the Karuk, Yurok, Taloa, Willicut, Chimariko. So very diverse areas and very diverse peoples. I always say that we're different nations, essentially. And so to think about Indigenous people, both in the United States and in other places around the world, you have to think about nationhood and the way that we assert our sovereignty, which can be different from each other. Something that's really interesting about California too, that I like to point out, is that California linguistics groups are completely different from each other. So you'll see the breakdown here on the right-hand side. So there's Athabascan, which is now known as the Dene language family, which is where Hupa situate their languages as Algonquin, Hogan, Penutian, Uto-Aztecian, and Yukian. And these designations are changing all the time as we're getting a better understanding of California Indian linguistics and as there has been revitalization of California Indian languages. So something I also like to mention about the Northwest area where I'm from is that Hupa, Yurok, and Karuks, we speak completely different languages. There's nothing really similar about them at all. And there's not even really any loan words that come out of it. So loan words being like a Hupa word would be in a Yurok grammar. That doesn't happen up on the Klamath. So I mention this because I really want to make sure that we understand that there is this distinction amongst the tribes up on the Klamath, both in culture, in language, and in the ways that we are also seeing dam removal and the ways in which we're seeing dam removal and the efforts to remove the dams on the Klamath. So I focus on 3 nations related to my dissertation work. There are many other nations that are invested in dam removal on the Klamath. So I really look at the lower Klamath River, the Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk people who, along with the Klamath Shasta peoples as well, have been leading the fight towards removal of the dams on the Klamath River Basin. And so on the left hand, you'll see a photograph by Edward Curtis, a very famous salvage photographer who went around the United States taking photographs of Native people that he felt were vanishing. So it kind of perpetuates this myth of the vanishing Indian. So that photograph I like to include because this person was likely not living in the way that Edward Curtis was documenting, but really trying to place the settler imagination of Indigenous people onto, without really considering the reality of our lives at that time. So I always kind of like to say too that during the time that this photograph was taken, my grandfather's family were dairy farmers in the Hoopa Valley. So it's a very different kind of reality of California Indian life at the time that it was taken, but also goes into this narrative of vanishing Indian. And then there's a photograph in the middle of a hanta. I think this was taken at Sumeg Village in Patrick's Point. And then on the right is Lemony, and she is a young woman now. And so I like to include these photographs to just really point out, especially the more modern photographs, that we still do our ceremonial practice. We're still invested in our languages. We're invested in our land. So Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk people are still situated in the areas that they're from, which is modern day Humboldt County, Del Norte County, and Siskiyou County. So I've been talking a lot about the Klamath River, but I haven't offered you a map. So here's a map of the Klamath River Basin as it situates between Oregon and California. And as we know, borders are a imaginary construct that is situated between these 2 settler states, so Oregon and California, which is interesting because then you get different sorts of environmental regulations that come from the upper Klamath and then to the lower Klamath as it relates to the states of California and Oregon. But the federal government also manages the water in this area through the Bureau of Reclamation. So that's also important to note. So there's 3 competing entities that are interested in this place, along with corporate interest with the Klamath River dams, which I'll get to in a minute. But the Klamath River Basin is one of the largest basin areas in the West. And when the dams are removed, because they will be removed, it will be the largest dam removal effort in the United States. So I just want to give you a sense of what that looks like. And so the Trinity River is actually, I also want to note the Trinity River because that is the river of most importance to the Hoopa people. And the Trinity River is the largest tributary on the Klamath. So it's down here in this area. And so diversions from the Klamath also impact the Trinity. And then the Trinity is also impacted from water diversion to the Sacramento River from the Lewiston and Trinity dams. So the Trinity River gets diversions from both ends, making it a very, very threatened river too. My cats are running around. I'm sorry if I pause for a minute. So the Klamath River is home. So the tribes of the Hoopa, Yurok, and Shasta, Karuk, and Klamath rivers and its tributaries, the Trinity and the Salmon, are the ones I like to point out because they're essential to the Hoopa and Karuk peoples, depend on the basin for cultural and physical renewal. My grandpa always would say that we're river people. You know, the river is our home. It's what feeds us and sustains us. We still fish along the river sites. So we do dip net fishing. We used to do weir dam fishing as well, which was a really important way to get food. You know, salmon are our more than human kin. Salmon return to the Trinity and Klamath rivers. So the salmon that go out into the ocean, morph, and then come back, they are descendants of a long generation of salmon that have come and gone. So we really see ourselves within the salmon and the life that is in the Trinity River. Without the salmon, we cease to be who we are. So we're also salmon people. So we have a very strong kinship relationship to salmon. And Dr. Ketcher-Baldi who's a professor of Native American Studies at Humboldt State, and Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk, tribal member and descendant, always likes to mention that, you know, we don't catch salmon because we want to put it on our wall because it's the biggest fish. We catch it and eat it and have a relationship with it because it's essential to who we are, and it's a really circular relationship. So it's our responsibility to take care of salmon, and in part of that is taking care of the river and waterways. And fishing is a community event, so families fish for Chinook, Coho salmon, steelhead, and coastal cutthroat trout, green and white sturgeon, and Pacific lamprey. And, you know, if there are other tribal members from California on here, I'm going to just go out and say it, that the Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk salmon is the best. we you know, smoke it the best. It tastes the best. I just like to say that as a joke. Well, it's not a joke. I'm serious about it. But, you know, the way that we smoke our salmon is really important to us. And there's a little bit of a competitiveness that goes on with the salmon cooking. But all jokes aside, salmon is really important to many other indigenous nations in California, Oregon, Washington, and beyond. It's an essential salmon, and it's an essential fish species, and it's often threatened in different waterways as well beyond the Klamath River. So it says Ron Reed, and they're doing dip net fishing. It's pretty dangerous, actually. If you can see, you can be pulled into the water pretty easily. So you have to be pretty strong and pretty steady when you're fishing for salmon and different fish species. So a big part of my dissertation work is looking at world renewal or fix the earth epistemologies. So our relational environment and our relation to each other through ceremony is through world renewal ceremonies. So it depends on the tribe that you're going to these ceremonial practices at. Some tribes hold them once a year, some hold them once every 2 years. But they are a community event. And so each year or every 2 years, we believe that the world has become imbalanced. So I'm gonna hold my hand out to show you what the imbalance looks like. The world has become imbalanced, and it's the responsibility of Fix the Earth people, as Julian Lang likes to say, Fix the Earth people to put the world back into balance through our own ceremonial practices. So this is through the dance, the white deerskin dance, the jump dance, the white deerskin dance and the jump dance. So it's really essential to who we are to continue these ceremonial practices. So I put a historical photo of men doing the white deerskin dance. And then on the right is Chance Carpenter and Dakota. And they are both doing the brush dance, which is a childhood sickness dance to make children well. So another part of the world renewal ceremonies is the boat dance, which happens on the water. So you'll see a big dugout canoe and men dancing in that canoe and going up and down to the different ceremonial sites. It's quite a sight to see. And so water is a really essential part of these dances as well, because they take place literally on the water, or next to village sites that are next to the water. And so something I really want to reiterate here is that these dances are still essential and vital to who we are. We still do them, and they haven't disappeared or gone away. So language is also a really important part of our practice up on the North Coast. I mentioned pretty strongly that our languages are very different from each other. And so part of the dissertation that I'm looking at is how language informs placemaking and how we consider language and the way that we think about our places through our languages. So a component of that is the Hupa word for the Trinity River. I still have not mastered how to say this word, so in an effort not to butcher my home language, I won't say it, but on the right-hand side, you'll see it spelled out. And then the secondary word is Hun. So the Trinity River for the Hupa people, and remember the Trinity is a tributary of the Klamath. So that's an important part, it's a part of the Klamath River Basin. So the Trinity River translates to as a power one should pray to. So that signifies that it is an essential source of power, it is an essential source of renewal, physical and cultural renewal and sustenance. So it's a really important space for the Hupa people. As I mentioned, we're river people. The river is our home. We consider it a very important site of praxis. And Hun is the secondary word for river. So Hun refers to every other river that exists. So right now I'm in the Sacramento Valley and I'm situating myself in the rivers of the Sacramento and the American. And so when I'm thinking about the Sacramento and American, I might say Hun in my head. And Hun always refers back to the Trinity River. And so I think about Vine DeLoyer Jr. here, where he notes that no matter where Indigenous people are, place is always centered in their mind. And so when I'm here in the Sacramento and American River Valleys, I'm always considering back to my homelands in the Trinity River. And that is an essential part of who I am as being a Trinity River tribal person. So I just wanted to note that as we're thinking about place naming, Dr. Willie Bauer has written California Through Native Eyes that also goes more into depth in place naming and why that matters in the context of California Indian history. So we see these places have changed names. Even the name for the Hupa people is not our original name. And so how are we then reclaiming our places by remembering stories, talking about our creation stories, and then also adding in linguistic elements to our places. So problems on the Klamath and its tributaries. So a number of dams were built in the early 21st century or the 20th century related to water diversion and farming in Oregon and Northern California, mainly in Oregon. And so Eastern Oregon is a fairly arid desert. It has a lot of aridity. And so there was a call in the early parts of the 20th century to create farms and farming families up in Eastern Oregon. And so a lot of that then means that the Klamath River needed to be dammed and irrigated. And you saw that there was the large Klamath Lake too that has been affected by this. And so those farms need water, so you get dams that then allows for diversion into Southern Oregon farms. So there's a lot of alfalfa farms in Southern Oregon. And then also the dams are constructed for hydroelectricity. So hydroelectric dams to supply power to people in the Klamath River Basin in California and Oregon. So there's a big call for that. And I'm really glossing over that history in the in the name of time. But so that occurs from 1903 to 1962 when the dams are constructed on the Klamath. And so because a lot of that water is diverted from the upper Klamath, then the lower Klamath gets less water yields. So water then becomes more scarce as years go on, and ceremonial practice and fishing practice is impacted on the Klamath River Basin as well. So my grandfather, he always used to say, you know, the old timers, he could call them old timers, would tell stories about how the Trinity River, you could see salmon and it looked like you could walk on their backs. Like the river was so full of salmon. And the Hupa are like lower Klamath River Basin too. So this would be after like the upriver tribes would have gotten salmon coming down from their areas as well. So he would describe it as you could go and pick up the salmon basically and just walk home with it. But as the river is diverted on the Klamath River, as the river is diverted, you get less fish because they have an inability to get over the dams, and then also creates dangerous conditions like warm water conditions on the Klamath River as well. So on the right-hand side, you'll see toxic algae blooms that are caused by warm water conditions. And salmon are a cold water fish, so they need deep cold water to survive. So this is catalyzed into creating problems that occur over decades. So this is just a sense of what the Klamath River looks like, map of a threatened river, so where the dams are located as well. So the Link River Dam, Keno Dam, J.C. Boyle, Fall Creek, Copco Dams 1 and 2, and Iron Gate. So you can see that most of the dams are in the upper basin and they mostly are in Oregon. And so creates these dangerous conditions that occur in the lower basin. And the dams, just for your knowledge right now, the dams that are subject for removal are Iron Gate, built in 1962, Copco Dams 1 and 2, 1917, 1925, and J.C. Boyle, which was constructed in 1958. So some of the newer dams. So the dams, as I have been talking about, create conditions for the 2002 salmon fish kill on the Klamath River Basin. So I was, maybe I'm aging myself, I was 16 when this occurred. I remember when it happened. People were very devastated, and you know, we get all these pictures of what it looked like, and it killed upward of 80,000, estimates are about 70 to 80,000 mature Chinook and Coho salmon. So that's extremely devastating, especially because they are mature salmon, just trying to live their lives in the river systems that they have known since time immemorial. And so, and I apologize, some of these photographs are a little jarring. They're still difficult for me to look at, and I've looked at them a lot over the years, but you'll see some of the condition, the ecological disaster that occurred. And the fish kill was really because in 2001, it was a dry and arid year. The Department of the Interior and Bureau of Reclamation decided that the salmon needed more water down into the lower Klamath. There was then an action from Oregon farmers where they broke some of the pipelines that diverted water into the upper Klamath River. The federal government goes back and says, okay, never mind, we'll divert the water up into the upper basin. And then the fish kill happens in 2002. So it's kind of this waffling between policy that occurs and creates the conditions that then create the salmon fish kill. And this was really the start. There had been other advocacy movements before this. So the area that I'm from is actually, I think, pretty well known for doing advocacy against federal, state, and corporate interest, which is, so we come from a long line of activists. And I would say that for many California Indian people too, across the state, and actually United States and the world. You know, we have been long advocating for ourselves in our environment. But so this was really the catalyst of this movement on the Klamath River. So Leif Hillman, who's Karuk, and he's now the natural resources head for the Karuk Department of Natural Resources. But he mentioned when I interviewed him that, you know, we saw this happening. We grabbed a couple beers, went down to the river, and started talking about what we can do. And so the Klamath Justice Coalition is formed from those early discussions. And so they begin a strong advocacy movement going first to Scottish powers. So the dams were originally owned by Scottish Power in Scotland. And so they rounded up a group of high schoolers, young people. So youth advocates are really important in this movement and have been really important in Native American ecological rights movements as well. So got children, young, old, elderly, adults to go out and crash the shareholders meetings at Scottish Power. So on the right hand, you'll see an activist holding Red Power meets Scottish Power. I love that sign. But so Scottish Power then backs off and says, okay, well, we'll do what we can to start considering removing the dams on the Klamath, but then within the year, they sell the dams to PacifiCorp, so which is a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett's company. So after that, the advocacy moves around. So Warren Buffett is based in Omaha. So there are many actions that occur in Omaha outside of his house as the years go on and as the dams remain. So there are actions on the left-hand side. You'll see Dying for Water, Save the Salmon, Save the River, Save Our Ways of Life. And then in Portland, Oregon as well, where PacifiCorp is headquartered. And then in Sacramento to start getting gubernatorial attention towards it, and then also in Oregon in the state capitol building there, because as I mentioned in the beginning of this, the Klamath River and the dams are situated between Oregon and California, so there's an interest from both the state. But the grassroots advocacy is really starts as a word of mouth type of thing. People have their families and they go and they do actions. They protest at different departmental meetings through that are in policies that are being made around water rights on the upper and lower Klamath. So the State Water Resources Control Board in California has an interest in this as well. So people will go and testify at their meetings when they're having meetings about relicensing or recommissioning or water rights issues that are occurring there. So same with federal government. So wherever like people are talking about the Klamath River Basin, you'll find Native activists there to respond, which is awesome, I think. So I had already talked a lot about the Klamath Justice Coalition actions in Scotland, Nebraska, Oregon, and California, but these are some photographs, and these are historic photographs that come from the advocates themselves. So Regina Chichizola, who's the head pretty much of Save California Salmon, she has been really generous in offering, which is a nonprofit organization that works on water issues in the state. And yeah, in the state. So she has generously like given me access to these photographs to really show what the movement looks like and how people have situated themselves in this movement. And so, you know, our praxis, our world renewal praxis is that we as Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk people believe that we have a responsibility to fix the world, both through ceremony and through protection of the environment and protection of our environment. So removal of the dams is really essential to remaking our worlds for towards a decolonial future. So the heart of the basin, Indigenous artists and activists. So when I began thinking about my dissertation project, I really wanted to build upon the work that I was doing in my master's program at Sacramento State. So I curated an exhibit called Stories of the River, Stories of the People, Memory on the Klamath River Basin, related to the dam removal efforts that were happening in the area that had been ongoing for many years, which I had seen as I became a young person to a young adult. And so when I went into my PhD program, I really wanted to highlight the way that Indigenous artists have contributed to this movement. This is probably one of the most important Indigenous arts movements that I've seen. Maybe I'm a little biased, but related to ecological action that's occurred because it comes from both grassroots artists, so people who are going and working with youth and making signs. So all the great signs that I showed you are part of that movement, that grassroots movement, meeting at people's houses, making signs, going out, protesting, but also through ephemera. So Stop the Killing, which is Release the Trinity Flow. On the left-hand side is a t-shirt that you'll see. That's actually me wearing it. I added action at the Bureau of Reclamation in 2014. In the middle is from Yurok artist Analia Hillman, who has been one of the leaders in the Klamath Justice Coalition movement. No mounting stalling will stop the dams from falling. And then on the right-hand side is painting, acrylic paintings, fine arts from Lynn Risling, who is a prolific artist up on the North Coast. And of course, my internet decides to go out during a presentation, but I'm glad that many of you have stayed on to hear the end of the talk. And so giving you a taste of everything that was happening. So I was talking a little bit about the Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk activists that I look at in my dissertation. So Lynn also is a very prolific artist up on the North Coast. If you ever have a chance of buying her artwork or her print or any of the artists I'm talking about as well, I recommend that you do so. So Lynn on the right-hand side, so the two photographs on the top, on the left is from Julian that situates the Klamath River with Karuk space. And then on the right-hand side is a piece from Lynn. And these are both from my curated exhibit that I produced in 2013. And then on the lower left is a piece from Brian Tripp, who is also a prolific artist and was involved in a curated exhibit called River as Home up in Eureka, California, which is We Outlands, and curated by Brittany Britton and Lynn Risling and Julian and Chad Lowry. So praying for the river to come back. And then on the right hand is Brittany Britton, who is a mixed media artist and Hupa tribal member, and her work is really amazing as well. So if you ever have a chance to see it or interact with it, I definitely recommend that you do so. So signage and ephemera from the basin. So on the left-hand side, so we actually had a big day of action on October 23rd around the Undam the Klamath issues. And so I'll go a little bit later into the updates and what was happening as we were doing some of these advocacy movements. And then in the middle is Molly White, first the buffalo, now the salmon. So that's actually up in Portland when at a Pacificor shareholders meeting. And then on the right-hand side, we stand for the waters we stand. And so Patagonia, the outdoor company, has actually matched funds and has supported different organizations up on the Klamath River Basin surrounding water rights and this issue. So Klamath Basin poetry, performance, and literature. So on the left, you'll see, and you could buy this book. I use it in my dissertation. Salmon is Everything, community-based theater in the Klamath watershed. So Theresa May got a group of tribal students and tribal poets and writers together to create a play called Salmon is Everything. It's really fantastic. In the middle, you'll see a still from a photograph of that, from a performance of that. And then The Smokehouse Boys by Shauna Oteka McCovey discusses some of the issues both on the Klamath River related to water rights removal, advocacy, but also life on the reservation and what it means to be from a place that you've been dispossessed from. So I really like this poem. Through my body flows blood of singers and dancers, maker of dance regalia, carvers and basket makers, gatherers, hunters and fishermen, and believers in their traditional religion and the old ways. I know I am these people, and I have done all these things before many, many years ago. So it's from Brian Tripp. And I really like that poem because it connects who we are as Native people to our ancestors, our ancestral ties. So we believe that we have a strong relationship with our ancestors. When we're doing our ceremonies, we call them down and we all dance together. And so we still have very, very strong ties to those people. You know, my grandfather passed away last year and it was really difficult. But I believe that when we do our ceremony practice, that we call him down and he's with me when I'm in that space. So this has been a near 20-year fight for justice on the Klamath, 2002 to present. There have been continued actions at Pacificor and Warren Buffett's private residence in North Dakota. There has been, as things have progressed over the years related to the Klamath Dam removal efforts, there's been online letter writing, calls to state agencies, governor's office, and protests at government offices. Just recently, so I sit on the board of Save California Salmon with Regina and Kutcher Baldy and a number of other strong advocates up on the Klamath and in neighboring watersheds. So we put on a Mobilizing for Water Justice, and that was organized by Save California Salmon and Humboldt State University's Native American Studies program, and youth actions and food sovereignty demonstrations. So youth have been really, really strong in this movement. Many of them have been born either just before 2002 or after 2002 and have been involved in the efforts to remove the Klamath River because it has been a lifelong thing for many people. And it's been a lifelong issue for me. And, you know, we won't stop until we see the river healthy again, until those dams are removed. Oh, and that's me on the left. So it's me at an action in 2014. He's younger, maybe about 26 or 27. And then my friend Vanessa, who's now a professor at Chico State University. So just a little bit more info about some of the media stuff that people do related to the Klamath River. So a big part of this effort too has been getting attention both nationally and internationally, and that's been really important to us to get more support, allied support for the removal of the dams and the health of the Klamath River. And so we have media challenges, best short video, best TikTok post for younger people, younger than me. I don't know what TikTok is. Best artwork, best banner, best meme or comic, so best youth submission. So you can see that with these advocacy movements, they have changed over time. So originally they started and still continue to be direct actions where we go to places, but I have also incorporated media theory. So using media as a form of advocacy and pushing for awareness of Klamath River issues. And so just to go back a little bit in the history of the Klamath, so in 2010, because of this advocacy effort that occurred for 8 years, so from 2002 to 2010, the Klamath Basin restoration agreements were signed. And this was also to credit to the tribal leadership from the Hoopa, the Karuk and Yurok people. So the Hoopas didn't sign on to this at all. The Hoopa tribe didn't sign on to this at all. But the KBRA was designed to balance water use between environment and agriculture, fund fisheries restoration, improve irrigation infrastructure, and provide economic development programs for local communities. So this was a big agreement and actually incorporated the most of any of the agreements that have come out of this. And so it's an agreement between state of California, Oregon, tribes, Pacific Court, and the federal government in California. So you see then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger signing the agreement. So he signed in 2010. But the KBRA lapsed in 2015. I remember when this happened too, because we were all really closely watching it. Lapsed in 2015 when US Congress failed to pass it because it was blocked by conservative members of the House who tend to be pro-dam. So it lapsed. But the Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement was signed in 2010, and that really details the removal of the 4 dams, Iron Gate, Copco 1, Copco 2, and J.C. Boyle. After KBRA expired, it was then amended and re-signed. So the new agreement provides for decommissioning the hydroelectric dams through the traditional Federal Energy Regulation Commission approval process. So there, as you can imagine, there's a lot of agreements, a lot of scientific study, a lot of consultation and collaborative relationships that go into a dam removal, especially a dam removal of this size. But the Klamath agreements, the KBRA had originally guaranteed that the dams would be removed by 2020. We're in 2020 right now, and they haven't been removed yet. But, so there's an update on that as well. I think because of the strong advocacy efforts that grassroots organizations had done, so October 23rd was our big day of action towards the Klamath River Klamath Dam removal efforts, and we had been, as grassroots people and organizations and activists, been moving towards pushing on the state and federal government and Pacific Court to remove the dams and to sign a new agreement. Tribes of the Yurok Karuk people met with the Governor Kate Brown administration in Oregon, Gavin Newsom's administration here in California, and then representatives from Berkshire Hathaway to develop a new memorandum of understanding, a memorandum of agreement. So the MOA has Pacific Court, Oregon, California, and the Karuk and Yurok tribes as signatories, and the KRRC, so I need to mention them as well, which is the Klamath River Restoration Corporation. And so they're an offshoot of the efforts that people have made towards the removal, and an entity that helps guide and support the dam removal efforts as well. So FERC was concerned about potential cost overruns. And so the MRA then has California and Oregon as co-licensees with KRRC, allowing Pacific Court to transfer ownership and responsibility for dam removal to the dam removal entity. So it places more onus upon KRRC in Oregon and California, and places less on Pacific Court. So you can take that for what you might think about that. But with all the agreements, there's always this discussion about, well, is it real? We've seen so many agreements over the years, 3 agreements over the years, that have promised removal of the dams by a certain date, then the date passes, and we're left to wonder whether we'll see our rivers healthy again. And so my dissertation looks also at the promises of the state and how the state makes promises with people. In September 2019, the governor of California apologized for the historic genocide of California Indian people, So we suffered a massive genocide in the state sanctioned. So it was legally permissible to kill Native people. And so the governor of California apologized for this state sanctioned genocide between the tutelar years of 1846 to 1873. And so my dissertation looks at, though, what ongoing cultural genocide that occurs with new water infrastructure projects that remove water from our lands, and what that means when the state then apologizes for and seeks truth and reconciliation narratives. So if we're continuously dispossessed from our lands, then what does an apology then mean for us into the future? And how then can we push upon the state for our lands back and the ability to have a say in these water diversion efforts that occur? So I'm thinking here of both the Klamath River Basin, but as I mentioned, the Trinity River is diverted into the Sacramento River that then goes down to the Bay Delta Tunnel efforts that are occurring in the Sacramento Valley that is then sent to Central Valley Farms. So while it's really great that the Klamath River is being removed, what about other water infrastructure projects that are occurring, and how does that continue the land dispossession that we face, which is a part of genocide and is a human rights violation? So that's a question that I have begun to ask in my dissertation study and have begun to think about in the way that we're looking at truth and reconciliation narratives around these major water projects. And so I also just want to end that it's really the people that have brought this together. You know, it's really great that the government and the governments, both tribal, federal, state, and you know, corporations have agreed to sign on to these things, but it really was because of pressure from advocates and activists who said that there needed to be a change on the Klamath. And we see that, you know, around the world where people are protesting pipelines, Standing Rock being the most famous example from 2016. But this effort on the Klamath River has received some attention, but not as much as I think that it deserves, in the way that people have come together and put themselves at great risk to stop continued extractive capitalism, extractive corporations, you know, extraction of our natural and environmental resources, the things that we depend on as Hupa, Karuk, and Yurok people. So I just want to end with, you know, I hope that you do consider not just what happens on the Klamath. The Klamath is really important to me, and I hope it should be important to you as well, but what's happening in your areas as well. You know, I guarantee that there's likely a fight somewhere related to climate change or ecological destruction that's occurring. So what are you doing to support those people who are most affected by it? And it doesn't have to be just Indigenous people, it's communities of color, it's marginalized communities, people who have often been tasked and asked, not even asked, but burdened with environmental injustice. And so that occurs everywhere. So thank you, and thank you for your patience with me as I dropped off for about 5 minutes, but I'm open to questions and willing and happy to talk. So thanks, Satya.
Thank you so much, Brittani. That was really fascinating. There are a few questions in the Q&A, so if we maybe start there. Michael Goodman has asked a couple of questions about the connections to Scotland, and what explains the interest of a Scottish corporation in a remote area of Northern California. And I wonder whether you might say just a little bit more about that moment. It was a fairly brief moment, wasn't it, when Scottish Power were in charge and then they ran away?
Yeah, and you see this a lot in other international corporations. So, I mean, Alicia could speak better to like Canadian corporations coming into the United States and, you know, facilitating or having pipelines that enact with the oil fields up in Canada as well. So you see that a lot of international corporations come into these places and then have an interest in water trading or water infrastructure like movement. So that explains a little bit about why Scottish Power was in this place in the first place. It could be lucrative to have a hydroelectric dam in an area. And so that's also a question that my dissertation looks at as well, is the way that international corporations profit off of indigenous lands. And it's not just in the United States, we see it in Central America and South America as well. So how is extractive capitalism, colonialism still ongoing in these places? And a lot of it, has to do with the money that can be made through extraction or trading water. So water is very lucrative in California and in Oregon, because whoever controls the water can control like farming interests, control like so you see like the Coca-Cola Corporation has a lot of interest in water because they need water to produce Coca-Cola. So water is a very lucrative entity to get involved in. And actually just recently, this doesn't have as much to do with the past actions, but recently you see that water is being traded as an option, like a financial option, which is horrific to me. So, I mean, these things are very lucrative to get involved in for international corporations.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So you seem to suggest that the protests at Scottish Power made a difference, but then they sold up. Did they sell up because they realized that they couldn't or wouldn't make the changes that were being asked of them, or?
I think they just wanted to get away from liability.
Yeah.
And they couldn't and they wouldn't make the changes. So it's easier to sell something than have to deal with this, grassroots group of people coming at you all the time. I think it also is a PR issue too. It doesn't look good if, indigenous people are going halfway across the world to come and protest you.
Indeed. Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So the next question is from Bruno Serafin, who says, thanks for the great presentation. Can you expand on the idea of visual sovereignty as you are using it?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have also talked a little bit more about visual sovereignty. So visual sovereignty, I use Michelle Rahija a lot in her discussions about visual sovereignty, and she's looking at it through film. But it really is the ways in which Indigenous and Native people have pushed and perpetuated their sovereignty through different mediums that maybe people don't think as being sovereign, but using like painting and art and performance and film to perpetuate their decolonial visions out into the world is how I kind of define visual sovereignty. And so she usually uses it by looking at like the ways that Native a part of it, by looking at how Native actors, when they're acting in John Wayne, John Ford films, are winking at the camera. A famous example she uses is Nanook of the North, who, is portrayed as being kind of a simple Native person, but really she was saying he was enacting his sovereignty by even participating in the film and then making fun of the filmmakers as they were going along and producing that film, which I think is great. But the ways that the Klamath River people have enacted it is through this visual sovereignty methodology by pushing out world renewal praxis and epistemology related to this effort on the Klamath River. And it's not, I focus narrowly on the Klamath River, but they're also doing it through like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So there's a lot of art that's produced from the Klamath related to that. There's a lot of art that's produced related to ceremonial practice and situating it within our present world. So that's how I'm defining visual sovereignty as it relates to the Klamath River efforts.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting just watching. I mean, I was struck the other day looking back at protests in the 70s at places like Wounded Knee, the volumes of art that were produced there, in that instance by members of Indians of all nations, and obviously recently the No Dapple protests have generated a lot of art. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, as you said, there are a lot of artists working actively on that. It's really fascinating that close relationship between art and other forms of activism in all of these instances. Okay, so William Bauer then asks, how do the dams and the toxic algae bloom affect or prevent Hupa from performing world renewal or other ceremonies?
Hi, Dr. Bauer. Dr. Bauer is one of my advisors. So it's good. I'm glad that you're on the call. So the dams, so every year, what has ended up happening almost every year. So that action where I have a picture of myself wearing that t-shirt, release the Trinity flow. So every year, almost like clockwork in August, we'd have to go to the Bureau of Reclamation and do a protest outside of their Sacramento offices to get them to release more water into the dams so that we can do our dances and our ceremonies. So if the water level is so low that you can't get a boat onto the river to go up and down, then it infringes on our ability to do our ceremonies on that river. So it goes also into the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. So a lot of people call on that too in 1976, that allows, tribes to have their ceremonial practice, the ability to do their ceremonial religious practice freely. So it affects the dams when the dams are, releases of the water are situated within the dam issue. So dam releases have to happen for us to get enough water to go down into the lower Klamath Basin. And then toxic algae blooms are very dangerous. They're actually, when there are algae bloom events that occur on the Trinity or the Klamath, the tribes will tell people, tribal governments will tell people not to let their dogs drink the water because they'll die. They do. So you can't swim in the water, you can't interact with the water. So that also takes away a lot of our ability to have a relationship with water if it's poisoned. And we have an inability to both dance or do our ceremonies there as well, but also live freely and without the threat of death too. Keep your children away from the water is a common theme up there too. You don't want your kids to go and get sick off of the algae blooms. You don't want your dogs to die or animals to die, but that happens.
Yeah, gosh, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Matt Whittle, who asks first if the map of the river included information about the extinction of different species, and whether it's possible to say a little bit more about how the dams have led to species loss.
Yeah, sorry, I have a lot of information in a 45-minute presentation, and so I'll elaborate a little bit on that. So as I mentioned in Dr. Bauer's point, so the dams really control the flows of water as it goes into the upper and the lower Klamath Basin. And then also, because the fish have to go down and situate themselves back and forth between the rivers. So salmon are also they're an amazing species. They're freshwater and saltwater fish. So they start their life on the Klamath and its tributaries. So whatever tributary it starts at. And then, the mature salmon lay eggs, and then the salmon grow up, and then they go and situate themselves back down into the ocean. So they become ocean fish. So this is an aside, but corporate fishermen are also interested in this because they depend on those like ocean fish for, livelihood. So they also fish off into the oceans. And then the fish come back and become freshwater fish again, and then start the cycle anew with their new fish. The issue with the dams, though, is that the dams prevent the fish from being able to go upriver into their traditional spawning areas. So they block a lot of the salmon from going up. And an issue, too, with these dams is that there's no fish ladders associated with them. And the cost of putting fish ladders is so great that the decision, it was an essential part of why the decision was to remove the dams at all, just to remove the dams, because of the cost of the fish ladders to incorporate them into the older dams, because people weren't doing that in the 1950s or 20s when the dams were constructed. And so it really hinders the fish's ability to go back to the places that they're at. So it leads to species loss as well, because fish die, they aren't able to produce as much numbers as they normally would. Also the low water levels on the lower Klamath. So when the water is diverted up into Oregon, or where there's diversions down into the Sacramento Valley for the Trinity, fish depend on cold water. The salmon, coho, and Chinook are cold water fish. They need cold water. And so the low level of water on the rivers then makes for warm conditions that are deadly. And then they also get a disease, a gill disease on their neck. So I'm pointing at my neck because that's where it would be at, because of the low water and the toxicity in the water. So it chokes them up. So the fish are like getting inundated across the board as related to these dams. And it's really at the behest, or I don't know if behest is the right word, but it's at the pleasure or of the Bureau of Reclamation when they decide to release water. So that's why we do a lot of advocacy efforts too related to water flows. It's like, well, we need to actually have these fish to be healthy. So it contributes to the endangered species aspect of Chinook and Coho salmon on the Klamath.
Wow, and presumably it has a significant impact on other species that rely on salmon for food, and the things that the salmon would normally eat.
Yeah, so I'm focusing only on the salmon right now, but it also affects, trout species, lamprey species that are in the Klamath, and also the animals that do, like you mentioned, David, that eat salmon out into the ocean that depend on it. And you see that most acutely up in Oregon and Washington related to killer whale species there too.
Thank you. Okay, so George Toth, building off the Scottish questions, is wondering what restoration and reconciliation between Native nations and Scotland would look like, noting that Scottish self-image is quite powerfully about protecting environment and standing for social justice. It was a great point. I mean, I was thinking about this only recently. The present Scottish government disavowed their relationship to John Macdonald, the first Canadian Prime Minister, who was responsible for very significant damage done to Indigenous communities in Canada. I don't know, so I guess it's a thought experiment. What might that look like to kind of try to repair some of that damage that Scottish power caused?
One of my advisors came up with this really interesting idea. So I don't want to take credit for this idea, but Dr. Liza Grandia, and we were talking about the ways in which we were talking about like oil companies, but developing some kind of conference or discussion or journal. I mean, I'm thinking about it in an academic way, but like journal articles that are talking about the relationship between these oil places, oil corporations, and Indigenous people, really centered on Indigenous people's responses to that. But in thinking about that question, it's like, well, what does it look like then to look at dams and international corporations that invest in dams, like Scottish Power, as an international study towards a discussion between the two places. I mean, because Karuk, Hupa, and Yurok peoples and other peoples across the United States and Central Canada, South America, we're, sovereign nations. We have inherent sovereignty, and there's a way to talk to, I think, between nations about that, but also through like, I have a lot of critiques about truth and healing in general, but I think truth is an important part of that. Reconciliation, I think, is something very different and will look differently to different people. as we've seen across the world through different commissions and how they deal with it. But truth is really important. So like how much do Scottish people know about their, their ties to this place in rural California, which maybe nobody had ever thought of before. So having these discussions, and especially because, being able to speak to an international audience about this opens up that kind of discussion as well, because it hasn't really occurred here in California. We talk about Scottish power as a moment in time, but never really talk about the reconciliation or the truth aspects of that as well. So, I mean, I don't have a direct answer other to say that I think that opening those lines would be really important.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's a really important point. Just wondering what it would look like to actually try to address some of these issues directly with the Scottish government. That's another conversation, perhaps we can return to that. So I guess on a slightly similar note, Chiara Minestrelli asks whether there have been any connections with the Winnemem Wintu people and the Shasta Dam protests, and whether you've shared strategies.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And Chief Colleen Sisk, who's the leader of the Winnemem Wintu people, really powerful speaker. She's on the board of Save California Salmon, actually, along with me. And so we have worked with them through our organizational framework, Save California Salmon, on helping and assisting the Winnemem Wintu people on the Shasta Dam raise that's being proposed and is ongoing right now. So I mentioned, the Klamath River. It's really great that these agreements are signed, but there's still these other things, water infrastructure projects that are occurring to the Winnemem Wintu people, to the people in the Bay Delta region that are dealing with the Delta tunnels that are being, moved through the process. And so that's my question. And well, that's a part of my dissertation, is looking at how these river systems are connected, and you can't just cut one place up and then say, okay, well, we did a good thing here, but we're going to continue this Shasta Dam raise. They're all connected, especially because the Shasta Dam is really incorporated into the Sacramento River, which is a part of the Trinity River. So there has been a lot of intertribal movement with the Winnemem Wintu and in solidarity with them. So there's definitely been discussions, I think, across the tribal nations with each other towards that.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so are you all right to answer another couple of questions? We're pushing to.
Yeah, of course.
Pushing towards our time, but okay. So Charlotte Forget asks whether you could talk a little bit more about the Undam the Klamath Media Challenge and how social media can be a form of advocacy in Indigenous-led environmental justice movements. Yeah,
so that was actually, I mean, as everybody has been feeling, we're in the era of COVID-19, and unfortunately in the United States, it's been pretty bad here in relation to that. And so we began talking about, on the board of Save California Salmon, how we could, with advocates that we work with, how we could do a safe challenge, a media challenge, a safe advocacy effort related to the Undam the Klamath issues, because I think everybody was tired of waiting on hearing what was going to happen with the dams. We had been waiting for a long time. We had agreements that were reneged on. And so, this is at the forefront of, I think, many of the tribes' minds as well. And so we came up with the Undam the Klamath Media Challenge as a form of advocacy in Indigenous-led environmental justice movements. And that's a really important thing, especially now when we can't be around each other. We can't gather in big groups. We want to take care of our elders and our young and not, put them in danger. But it has been a really powerful method towards getting attention towards it as well. My Twitter is open and free for everybody to see. So I circulate that kind of information out to get perspective, to get, information out as well. We also had the Red Nation organization, which is led by Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie, and they did a really great job in allowing us to take over the Twitter. So we had a Twitter takeover with them, and they retweeted a bunch of things, and then it had an Instagram takeover as well. So that really was a grassroots way of doing that kind of work. So I think it's a really important form of advocacy, especially as we're all kind of sheltering in place inside. You know, the best way to be involved in land-based efforts, though, is to get to know the land that you're talking about, too. I think that's a really important site of intervention as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, thank you. So I'm just checking my clock and thinking about how hard you've already worked for us. But so Marta Klimkovitz asks if you could say a little bit more about the stories of your people and how they're still relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, we believe that, I mean, the Hupa people believe that we are, we've been in the Hoopa Valley since time immemorial. You know, we have ancestral spirits that that taught us how to be native in Hupa people. So, and we have a relationship with that space as well through that. So our creation story is centered in Hupa. And so Dr. Bauer, I'll give a shout out to him right now because his work has been really influential to me in thinking about creation stories and how they're situated across California and United States. And every place that has a creation story is important to that tribe and that area. And it doesn't negate any other creation stories that exist in other places, but rather it's a formation around other creation stories that protect the environment across time and space in California. That's the way I think about it, at least. And so the the Karuk and Yurok people too have their own creation stories and a relationship to their land, their traditional territories as well. And through that relationship, we uplift each other, and through those stories, we uplift each other and consider the ways in which we came into being. And those are different. The way that we think about the way that we came into being is different from each other, but it doesn't kind of take away from the importance of that area or that place, or understanding that in importance or place. So they're still very relevant. Stories are still very relevant. I mean, Deborah Miranda, who's a Ohlone scholar, who says that story is the most powerful force in the world. You know, the way that we consider our stories and situate our relationship to land are essential for Indigenous people, I think.
Thank you very much. Okay, so here's the last question. I'll call this the last one. Annette, so it would be pronounced Beecham here. Annette, apologies if I mispronounced it for you, but she says, apologies on behalf of the state for past genocide is interesting, especially since extractive practices continue, as you note. Could you say a little bit more about this issue and how you're theorizing these apologies given current struggles?
Yeah, so the state of California just announced their Truth and Healing Council, and so last week there was the first iteration of the council, which was interesting. I got to watch an hour of it, and I have friends who are on that council as well, including actually Chief Sisk is on that council too. And so the framework of it, from what I can tell, is that they're looking at the ways in which California's state curriculum, museums, different areas, the way that California talks about Native people. Because if you come to California, we can be very invisibilized in the population, despite having, you know, some of the highest numbers of tribal nations. So if you're looking at like the Colonial federal standard, we have 109 federally recognized tribes and over 100 other non-federally recognized tribes. So it's a lot of people, a lot of nations that we're speaking about. But the state and curriculum hasn't always reflected that really complex history has really uplifted settler narratives of place. So I'm thinking about the California mission system that we have, it's 1769, Winnipero Serra, how that's been uplifted, colonization through the gold rush, so how that's been uplifted at the expense of Indigenous stories. So the Truth and Healing Council is looking at that, which I think is an appropriate first step. But I think also a lot of those people on the council have been talking about, well, the truth is, it's like what I mentioned, truth is interesting and good, but what about, you know, land back? What about our lands back? What about our return of our lands that were forcefully taken from us through violence, through colonial violence? And so I've been thinking more and more in my dissertation about the ways in which truth and healing can be, I'm trying to say this in the best way possible, can be a, when it's uplifted, can be a avowal or disavowal of a continued, you know, genocide. That if you're apologizing for something that happened in the past, then you're not really considering how it impacts the present. So I was, you know, originally a little skeptical about the Truth and Healing Council, and I look forward to seeing the things that they do, because I have a lot of trust in the people that are on, who are on it. But I think we should always be considering those questions as well. So what if the state decides to apologize for the past, what does it mean for the present and ongoing struggles today? You know, and there's so many cases of truth and reconciliation throughout the world that you can look at, that where it's been more powerful and when it hasn't always worked out. So I'm just at the point where I'm thinking through and theorizing the way in which the state apologizes for violent actions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really powerful thought to end on, and particularly when, you know, these moments try to find line between an actual genuine gesture of reconciliation and a form of kind of self-absolution.
Yeah.
Apologized for that, so we don't have to worry about this thing that we're still doing. Well, Brittani, thank you ever so much. That was hugely informative and really fascinating, and I think so rich, given the ways you showed us how that work of visual sovereignty contributes so directly to other kinds of material activism in the Klamath River Basin, as well as introducing us to your work and your community. So thank you so much for your talk and for being with us. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and we will send out further information about the recording of this when we can, and also just to remind you of Alicia's plea from the beginning, which is there right at the very top of the chat before you leave. Should you feel able to contribute something to the Incomindios Lippuner Fund for next year's scholar. But once again, thank you ever so much, everybody. Have a good evening, and I hope you all have a good holiday season.
Thank you.